podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to this seminar on globalization. We're going to keep tackling the merits and pitfalls, the risks and opportunities of market globalization. And we're going to discuss a number of challenges in the global economy. The first one is globalization means the death of distance. In fact, the world is my neighbor. But in fact, if the world is flat, as Friedman says, whereas one can get access to anyone, anywhere, time pressure is mounting everywhere. There's a tremendous increase in productivity that leads to tremendous time pressure. We all know that, don't we? This is what Dominic Barton calls the tyranny of short term. And one of the key challenges of globalization is reconciling market time and social time. In 1980s, economic liberalization has led to higher productivity. And this has shifted the focus of managers and policymakers from long-term to short-term challenges. The best example of this growing myopia is probably hyper-speeding trading. What is clear is that the combination of globalization and new technologies of information and communication has increased time pressure on managers, so-called responsiveness revolution. And this has led also to a growing pressure of shareholders' value maximization. That's the tyranny of quarterly earning targets. The second challenge is how to bridge the wealth gap, the so-called economic divide. Well, we know for sure that the BRICS are catching up, these fast-growing economies in China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. But what does it mean? The acronym of BRICS was coined by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs in 2001, and basically, he put 5 countries in the same basket, countries with totally different socioeconomic and political structures. The bottom line is growing global inequality and concentration of extreme poverty in those countries that have not jumped on the growth ladder and stay on it. Where are they? Mainly Asia, South Asia, and of course Africa, Central Africa. Now the BRICS, are here on the screen, and the game plan was to know when will China or India catch up with the US or with Japan. China might catch up with the US in 2035, or more likely in 2025, but which China? That of the East Coast, industrial, well-developed, dynamic, benefiting from large foreign direct investment and modern technologies? Or that of Sichuan or Yunnan, which are still based on agriculture and with 19th century type industrial production? So the BRICS, and the catching up process does not tell you anything regarding wealth and income distribution. For sure, the emerging market countries grow faster. In fact, they grow twice as fast as the OECD. Between 1980 and 2014, the developing countries, grew at 5% and hardly 2.5 for the developed OECD countries. But growing faster doesn't help much to catch up if you start the race well behind the competitors. So these countries, will take 2 decades probably before, quote unquote, catching up not only the economic but the social development of the OECD countries. The G7 countries are projected to grow by 2% by the World Bank, and the IMF. And definitely, it is not at all, what will be known in fast-growing countries like Vietnam, probably 7-8%, China, probably 7% on average, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Malaysia will also grow at 6%. This is not enough, to eliminate, to eradicate poverty in these countries, in order to build up not only economic, industrial, but social infrastructures. So again, these countries' GDP might catch up, but development is still well behind. Making projections also is risky because socioeconomic growth does not depend only on investment, consumption, and exports. Look at Tunisia, look at Egypt. Economic growth, and development are the byproducts of a complex mix of economic, social, cultural, and political inputs. What is clear is that 160 countries, the so-called developing world, around 85% of the world population, account for only 50% of GDP and only 39% of trade. And vice versa, a small number of developed countries, the so-called OECD, 34 countries, account for 50% of global GDP and 61% of global trade. What is absolutely pathetic is that the poor countries in the 1980s are still often poor countries in 2013. All in all, around 25 countries in the world, developing most often in Africa, are still living with less than $2 per day, which means all in all $730 per year. The whole GDP of Africa, more than 25 countries, is hardly equal to that of Brazil today, $2,300 billion. The next challenge is the knowledge society, the so-called digital divide. Well, we have been told that NTIC brings connectivity, connectivity brings productivity, and this will lead to economic development and modernization. Fine. Yes, internet is a springboard for getting globalized. But how many people get globalized? In fact, all in all, 1/3, 2,500 million people, 2.5 billion people in the world, get connected to the new technologies of information and communication, i.e., in a nutshell, to internet. Around 1/3 of the population in the world has access to internet, but 3/4 live still in the developed countries. And there are more telephone lines, in Manhattan or New York than in the whole of Africa. This so-called digital divide has a major impact on growth and development, as internet accounts for 10% of GDP growth over the last 10 years. This new driver of economic development is still in the hands of a small number of industrial developed countries. And the challenge is to leverage the internet and the new technologies to promote not only economic growth, but human capital and sustainable development. Looking at the graph, we see clearly the digital divide. Less than 50% of the population with access to internet is still in Latin America, Middle East, Asia, and of course, Africa. So if we compare population and internet, we get this sort of graph, the so-called knowledge society. On the one side, you have the population having access to internet. On the left side, for example, in the US, close to 80% of the US population has access to internet, although it's only 5% of the world population. Regarding Asia, for example, 50% of the world population, but less than 30% has access to internet. Why such a digital divide? Basically, behind internet, you have the NTICs, and behind the NTICs, you have research and development. And in fact, 85% of the whole R&D in the world, it's still controlled by 3 regions: North America, EU, and Japan. Looking at the R&D investment effort, dividing R&D expenses by GDP, we see that it's more or less 2% in Europe, a bit higher in North America, in the US, much higher in Japan, 3.4%, and 4% in the north of Europe, Norway, Denmark, Finland. In the developing countries, including the most dynamic ones, Brazil, Russia, India, R&D is still less than 1%. Not mentioning Africa, where the only country basically embarking on the NTICs is probably South Africa and a little bit Tunisia in the north. The next challenge of globalization is volatility, the so-called spillover effect. I've said that globalization is an echo chamber. There's no periphery, and this means that you have tremendous impact of volatility, spillover, and contagion. Where does higher volatility come from? Well, it comes from a number of factors, including the flexible exchange rates after 1970s, including global economic and financial deregulation, 1970s, the spread of the new technology of information and communication, and also probably these offshore centers, hedge funds, that basically cross borders without asking questions. This graph shows you how volatile have been the stock market, for the last 20 years. Volatility, which was relatively subdued, modest in the 1960s, becomes now raging with ups and downs on a daily or hourly basis. It's enough to look at volatility of global capital flows to both developed and developing countries. It's striking to see that just on the eve of the global crisis in 2007, cross-border capital flows exploded to reach close to $1,200 billion. And then a substantial drop, almost overnight, in one single year in any case, during 2008 and 2009, affecting not only the economic growth of developed countries, but of course that of developing countries. This volatility can also be observed by looking at LIBOR, the London Interbank Offer Rate, which is a global rate of interest across markets in the world. It goes up and down, today touching a bottom close to zero, and for sure about to jump again next year due to the end of the liquidity injections by central banks in the world. This rising volatility affecting developing countries can also be observed by looking at oil, coal, gas, i.e. commodity prices. That's why countries with large commodity resources are still poor. Indeed, oil, cocoa, coffee, tin, copper do not make people richer in these producing countries. The sharp volatility in global market prices for commodities make traders rich in New York, in Zurich, or in London. The next challenge is that globalization leads to competitive market forces. And this leads also to capital concentration, mergers and acquisitions. And as competition, leads to capital concentration, this in fact shrinks competition. We can see this M&As between 1990 and today, reaching at times $2,500 billion in one single year. So you can imagine how many companies gets eaten up by their competitors, and this of course is eroding, shrinking, declining the competition. These M&As have been mostly the monopoly of large MNCs from developed countries, Japan, US, and the EU until the 1980s. Today, you can see the emergence of MNCs from the developing world, large MNCs from India, ArcelorMittal, of course, from Brazil, Petrobras, and also from China. But all in all, the largest MNCs still belong to a small number of modern, industrial, developed countries, US, Japan, and the EU. This combination of global competition and capital concentration through M&As leads to a situation where a few companies, in fact, control with a de facto monopoly a key sector of economic activities. In fact, the winner takes all. In aeronautics, automobile, computers, only a few competitors, in fact, are driving the ball game. Not only in the industrial, but also in the insurance and banking sectors. In the 1970s, the top 5 largest banks in the US accounted for 17% of total assets. Well, today these 5 banks account for more than 50% of total assets, the so-called too big to fail banks, which in fact take into hostage their national government. Global companies, hence, have emerged since 1960s, 70s. Their foreign sales account for more than half of total activities. Their foreign employees come from a large number of countries, and they are located in 100 or even 200 countries. As you know, one drinks Coca-Cola not only in the US and in the EU, but also in Cuba, in Peru, or in China. The ultimate example of the global company is Walmart, the US Carrefour. It has $466 billion of sales in one single year. It caters up to 245 million consumers every week. Its objective is to double sales within the next 5 years. And these sales, in fact, account for the total GDP of Argentina, for 5 times Morocco's GDP, and for more than 20 times Tanzania's GDP. The next challenge is the confrontation between market forces and state forces. What is true is that for the last 20 years, the diffusion of power away from national governments is a great political shift. Again, this is the end of the Westphalia world where you had a sovereign ruling a territory. Today, global markets rank nations like private businesses. The nation-state is no longer the deciding economic agent. That's a total change of paradigm. Until the 1990s, the state, had basically the control on the territory, on the military, on market forces, on information, on employment. It was, in fact, the economic deciding agent. That has been well analyzed by Keynes, who in fact considered that it was crucial for the nation-state to keep regulating, to keep controlling the economy. And today, in fact, nation-states are caught between market forces, rating agencies, and international financial organizations. In the globalized economy, markets give a premium to countries where economic liberalization, the so-called economic freedom, is larger. This is assessed, measured by the Heritage Foundation in the US, ranking countries depending on the business freedom. And we see that most of the fast-growing countries, including the BRICS, lay well behind. In these countries, the state still regulates and controls closely the market economy. The next and last challenge is the challenge of global regulation. On the one side, we have a political system which is still nation-based, at least since 1945 with the UN system. And in the meantime, we have, in fact, cross-border trade and capital flows, totally globalized hyper-finance. So there has been a number of attempts to regulate the economy, to regulate the financial markets, starting with the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, the IFIs, World Bank, IMF, the OECD, the RIF. But all these institutions, in fact, fail to regulate globalized market forces. there's one attempt by the IMF not to be the conductor or the regulator, but at least to inject some kind of regulation within the global economy. Let's look at it. First of all, we should not mix up the roles of the World Bank, the one side, and the IMF. The World Bank is a bank issuing long-term bonds to finance long-term development, whereas the IMF, is basically a firefighter injecting short-term liquidity in countries which face balance of payments crisis. The IMF is a de facto international credit union. It's a global institution. Today it has in fact 188 countries. Who is not member of the IMF? Well, Cuba and North Korea, maybe not for long. But as you can see on the screen, 188 member countries and only 24 directors sitting in this round table. So why? Well, it means that although the membership of the IMF is globalized, only a small number of developed countries still control the governance of the IMF. IMF quotas, which are in fact the resources used by the IMF to fight crises, stem from a small number of countries, the US, with a de facto veto power, the EU, and gradually the BRICS. But still, the OECD dominates the governance of the IMF. The IMF, as we can see here, intervenes to fight short-term, temporary liquidity crises. It was almost doomed to close its doors in 2005, 2006, and suddenly a number of phone calls have been made, with the 2008, 2009 global crisis, not any longer by developing countries, not Mexico, Brazil, or South Korea, but by developed countries, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, have got the help of the IMF. All in all, how to manage the pitfalls of globalization? There has been a few initiatives to create new institutions to stem the risk of global pitfalls. For example, the EU set up a few years ago a European Globalization Fund in order to provide emergency funds to European countries, to help workers to get access to training when they lose their job, to help promote new business, startups. But definitely, the key challenge is to transform economic growth into development. That's a major lesson of the global crisis. There has been years, decades of economic growth without enough equitable shared development. And all this boils down to the following challenge: how to provide the market economy with a social and long-term time horizon to avoid what Barton calls the tyranny of the short term. The global crisis is different this time. It is the first ever globalized crisis. It will reshuffle the cards not only of economic but also of political power. And the crisis might further unhinge Europe and the West from center stage. Their model of economic growth is no longer considered as the reference. All in all, the economic and political power centers of yesterday won't be those of tomorrow. These power centers get shifted to Shanghai, Dubai, Bombay, or Sao Paulo. 2 centuries of political and economic hegemony in the West are probably over in the new global economic system. Thank you.